Why are we so fascinated with the animals of prehistory? We take for granted our existence on the Earth, and we like to think of ourselves as being something special, unlike anything else that's ever existed. In reality, we've only existed in a tiny portion of the planet's history. Compared to that, to the many other animals that once existed, we imagine a past that we didn't exist in, populated by creatures that we couldn't compare to ourselves. It would be an alien world to us, with animals that seem like that they came straight out of a fantasy novel. Except, they weren't fictional, they really existed. But a very, very long time ago, before the likes of man, mammals, birds, and even dinosaurs, there was a time period where the most unexpected group of living animals would dominate the Earth.
To begin our journey, I've come here to the Welsh beach of Merlo Sands, where the fossils here date back to a time called the Silurian period, some 430 million years ago. Now, from where I'm standing, if we were to go back in time to the Silurian, we would be submerged underwater. Some of the animals you would encounter in the Silurian oceans would be animals that you can still find today, like the common jellyfish. Other animals would look strangely familiar, like the orthocone, and other animals were just too weird to describe, really. Life during this time was still only exclusive to the oceans. So if you were to come along the shoreline, you'd be disappointed to find a pretty barren wasteland. In the air, there would be little oxygen, mainly carbon dioxide, too intoxicating to really breathe. But while the animals were in the oceans, you would find at least one speck of life.
Plant life, absorbing and breathing in the carbon dioxide and breathing it out as air, turning the atmosphere of the Earth, rich in carbon dioxide, to something more desirable for the animals, oxygen, where over time the animals could evolve lungs perfectly capable into digesting the oxygen.
With a new atmosphere fully formed, it wasn't long before the animals began to explore this new landscape. But who was the first?
Brontoscorpio, the top predator of its day, was the first to leave the ocean and emerge onto land. From there they scavenged on whatever carcasses washed up along the shoreline. For Brontoscorpio and their arthropod relatives, this will set a stage as for the next 120 million years to come, for the only time in Earth's history, insects will dominate the planet.
The Silurian period only lasted roughly for about 24 million years, but during that time it saw a grand transformation, from the rise to the fish to the evolution of the amphibians.
The Devonian period not only saw a diversity with the animals, but also saw a dramatic change for the landscape.
Now, what all these land lovers had in common was that they were all carnivores, meaning that they only ate meat. So for the plant life that was existing at the time, it just kept on growing. There was no animals around to eat it all up. As for the tiny insects that were around, they just head further into the mainland, while the amphibians were still restricted by the coast.
Finding their sanctuary, some of the insects even evolved to survive strictly on the plants. Other animals such as lizards wouldn't evolve not for quite some time, but by the time they did, insects already held a foothold on illuming their shadows over them. 300 million years ago, the continents were beginning to collide into each other, which, within another 50 million years to come, would become one giant landmass, being known as Pangaea. For the United Kingdom, a large percentage of the landmass was submerged underwater, with Scotland being right at the centre of the equator, sharing the same landmass that would one day become Canada and America.
Or, in other words, let's say I was standing right here in Scotland, way back in the Carboniferous period. If I would have just taken a few paces over in that direction,
I would end up here in New York. Because of this splitting of this great landmass, paleontologists have been able to find fossils of the same animals that once inhabited all of these different countries. But what exactly did this landscape look like of this hodgepodge of continents? The globe was covered in a vast thick swamp, and with the abundance of trees, growing to heights of 50 meters, were actually distant relatives of ferns. The amount of forest that existed way back in the Carboniferous period would eventually break down and become the fossil fuel that would fuel the Industrial Revolution, and would go on and shape the world as we know it today. There was a much more higher frequency of oxygen during this time, and because how insects' metabolism works, it meant that they were much more bigger than usual. Although not every insect you would see would be recognisable. This unusual looking animal, also known as Hippotopterus, is actually a close relative of the sea scorpions, being close to the same size as a large dog. Another scorpion relative, Arachne, was actually once confused to be a massive spider. If this insect of an arthropod was still alive today, it would probably be hunting cats. But there was one particular group of insects that grew far larger than any other of those bugs. It grew as long as a car. Evidence remaining of this group of animals resides in the Scottish seaside town of Crail.
Now, for centuries, not a lot of people took much notice of these strange markings, but it wasn't until in 1854 that these type of markings were finally recognised as that being fossilised tracks belonging to a long-distant relative of modern-day centipedes and millipedes. This animal was given the name Pleura, which was Greek for jointed ribs. But since their discovery back in the 1800s, no completed specimen has ever been unearthed of Pleura, so trying to reconstruct this animal has been a massive headache for scientists.
Although, relating to much more completed specimens of related cousins to Pleura, it probably would have lacked antennas and a double-jointed external mouth, and would have had a dome-shaped head. Despite being the biggest insect of its day, Pleura would have strictly been an herbivore, only living off decaying and rotting plants. It could rear up straight, probably could have directly stared at you in the face.
It was due to the success of the Pleura size that it had no natural predators, but strangely enough, 299 million years ago, the Pleura disappears from the fossil records. Now I wonder why.
The answer lies only about an hour and a half away from Crail, the head city of Scotland, Edinburgh, built upon the charred remains of a volcano. Thankfully, for the residents of Edinburgh, the volcano hasn't been active for the last part of 60 million years. But the same could not be said for the peak time of the Carboniferous period, forming 350 million years ago due to the colliding continents. And with the added addition of the high frequency of oxygen within the atmosphere and the amount of forest, it would only take just one small spark to kickstart a massive fire. While the Edinburgh volcano likely only caused a local extinction, it was only the beginning. While the landmass Pangaea was forming across the globe, the world was getting warmer. The wet climate the forests were receiving, while massive deserts were taking their place. The insects could not survive this new climate. It was way too hot for them. The oxygen levels were heavily decreasing. The smaller insects fared better, but as for the colossal giants like Pleura, there was just no sanctuary in this new world. In the course of 80 million years, it led to new animals rising above, such as Dimetrodon, being part of the segue between the evolution from lizards to mammals, being related to you and I. But about 220 million years ago, as the Earth was fully healing and the Triassic period was coming to an end, a new group of animals would evolve. Well, I'm pretty sure you don't know what these animals are.